This story is predicated on the legitimacy of Ingo Swann. Aside from being the coolest name I've ever heard, Ingo was a hugely famous, and if you believe in that world, important psychic who pioneered a technique called remote viewing.
I am not this body in terms of consciousness, and consciousness can go places where the body cannot.
Whether you believe the story I'm about to tell you very much depends on your interpretation of not just the information, but the person giving the information. Not me, bang average barrel scraper right here, but Ingo Swann. If you believe he was a charlatan, you can pretty much ignore everything I'm going to say. However, if you think that there's a chance that there's any legitimacy to him at all, then the tale I'm about to tell you is incredible.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
They were promising us high-resolution photographs of the moon, but none have ever been released to this date. None.
China is investigating a mysterious hut on the far side of the moon. The rover is now traveling to take a closer look. A hut? What sort of aliens are you? I want my aliens to construct buildings with their minds, not some rocks they found down the nearest crater. Come on, aliens, do better. The moon is an object we see every day, and perhaps as a species, we take it a bit for granted. It is intrinsically connected to our life on this planet. Without it, entire ecosystems would change. But it's also a bit weird. For example, NASA performed experiments which found when an object impacted the moon, it rang like a bell. Welcome to the Moon series.
I've often recovered many of the thoughts about existence I had as a child. A major one of these was the separation of consciousness from the body, which was very real when I was a child.
Ingo Swann was born in 1933 in Colorado and became aware very early on that he wasn't a regular child. He possessed psychic abilities. As an adult, he obtained a double bachelor's degree in biology and art. He also served in the US Army. It wasn't until the late 60s, early 70s, however, that Swann's psychic abilities took center stage in his life.
I'm not the first to imply that we're not alone in the universe.
Enter the American Society for Psychical Research, which Wikipedia tells me is the oldest psychical research organization in the USA. I'll take their word for it. Swann took part in several experiments with this organization. In 1971, he successfully managed to influence the temperature in thermos bottles placed 25 yards away from him. And then comes the experiment which launched Swann to fame. Several sealed boxes were placed on a small platform above Swann's head, each box containing a different symbol illuminated from the inside using a light. Seated in a chair with no direct view of the contents of the box, Swann was tasked with correctly identifying the symbols within the boxes. The method Swann used was a very early version of what is known as remote viewing. The Men Who Stare at Ghosts was a movie involving remote viewing, a method whereby you transport your mind to another place when your physical body is still in the same place. I explained that suitably terribly. You get the idea?
I think it's very real, and many people do too.
Something that, to be fair, sounds like utter horse. But many well-qualified scientists took a keen interest in Swann's remote viewing. They took him seriously. Very seriously. Remarkably, Swann was successful in describing many of the symbols within the boxes, but it was something else that astounded the researchers. On one occasion, when asked what the symbol was in the box, Swann said, "I can't see it." Confused, the researchers turned to him, and Swann further stated, "The light's gone out." True enough, when the researchers approached the box, opened the lid, they found that the light had gone out.
Things are going to change, and I know they are, and that's what I'm going to talk about today.
Swann's abilities attracted the attention of quantum physicist Dr. Hal Puthoff from the Stanford Research Institute.
We had worked with him for almost half a year doing more or less conventional parapsychology experiments.
If you're skeptical of the credentials of the American Society for Psychical Research, the same doesn't apply to the Stanford Institute. This was a highly qualified credentialed team of scientists, and it's here at the Stanford Institute where Swann's abilities were tested not just in terms of objects a matter of feet from him, but on other planets.
These experiments must now pass the next scientific hurdle of being independently repeated in other laboratories.
In many ways, it could be seen as a way to try and discredit Swann's claims. What transpired, however, was very different. In April 1973, Swann used his now highly tuned remote viewing technique to project his consciousness to Jupiter. Now, it's worth noting that in 1973, we knew very little about Jupiter. Swann was asked to describe the planet, and with good success, he managed to describe many features which have been scientifically verified.
I see something that looks like a tornado. Is there a thermal inversion here? I bet there is.
He even sketched the features that we were seeing whilst visiting Jupiter. Here is a transcript where Swann highlighted verified after verified feature on the planet, such as a hydrogen mantle. Other verified features Swann saw included a high infrared reading, Temperature inversion?
An analysis was made of everything I said, and everything I said was correct.
Skeptics could argue that, well, really anyone with a keen interest in science could deduce that these things were present on Jupiter. However, Swann saw something else, a curious object around the planet, something that at the time nobody could have imagined. Very high in the atmosphere there are crystals. They glitter. Maybe the stripes are like bands of crystals, maybe like rings on Saturn. Of course, scientists at the time dismissed these claims. 6 years later, however, when probe Voyager 1, upon studying the outer solar system, passed by Jupiter, it discovered a ring.
So Hal came and said, "You're the first to find a ring around Jupiter." I said, "I am?"
And it was no longer niche organizations taking an interest in his work. It was the United States government.
All the work I was doing got classified, so I couldn't talk about it. And really still can't.
Enter Mr. Axelrod, that's what she said. Swann received a phone call from a friend in Washington, D.C., who told him that he's about to receive a mysterious call from someone called Mr. Axelrod to do exactly as he says, to not question him at all. And by the way, this conversation never happened. Around 4 weeks later, in the early hours of March 1975, Swann received the mysterious call. You've been selected to receive a cash prize. The mystery caller, using the pseudonym Mr. Axelrod, gave Ingo instructions to go to the Museum of National History at the Smithsonian by noon today and stand near the elephant in the central rotunda. Out of loyalty to his friend in Washington and an overriding sense of curiosity, Swann agreed.
Well, I was asked by some very mysterious people to do some remote viewing sessions.
Before we continue, you may be wondering how we know this information. Well, Swann documents it in his book Penetration. Word of advice when Googling penetration, make a note of who's standing around you. Trying to act natural but apprehensive, Swann stands near the elephant when a man approaches and gives him a card. It reads, "Please do not speak or ask any questions. This is for our safety as well as yours." Upon reading the card, Ingo noticed it wasn't just one man. It was twins. They quickly led Ingo outside and put him into a waiting car. As the car continues to transport a nervous Swann, he's handed one last card. "You are being taken to a helioport for further transport. Before we reach it, we will place a hood over your head." It is then when he was transported from the helicopter to a secret facility that things get even weirder. The helicopter lands and Swann is led out by the twins holding his arms. He descends, acutely aware that he's in a lift. He's then spun in circles by twins, led down several corridors, and eventually down a ramp. Pushed into a chair, he suddenly hears a voice. "I'm going to remove your hood now, Mr. Swann, and thank you for coming, as well as putting up with our procedures." Ingo Swann at this point was terrified of what he'd gotten himself into. The hood was removed, and there stood a man who introduced himself as Mr. Axelrod. Mr. Axelrod tells Ingo he cannot yet explain what the task is, but that he would be compensated $1,000 a day.
And they volunteered to pay me money, actually. Most of the work I ever got involved in hardly paid anything, you know. So I said, sure, I'd do it. And
Swann was told that he could not reveal any of what he was about to work on to anyone for 10 years. He wouldn't need to sign a document of secrecy, however, because this organization had no paper trail. For his cooperation, they would provide him with a comfortable room, a pool and a gym, and would provide him with his food preferences and cigar brands of choice. The only question left to answer was, what was the job?
then in this remote viewing sessions, well, you know, viewed some things on the moon that I thought were really outrageous.
The next day, a more composed Swann entered the remote viewing room, closed his eyes, and took to his task, using his remote viewing skills to see craters, rocks, and the usual formations you would expect to see on the moon. He did, however, tell Mr. Axelrod that it's very dark. He deduced that the coordinates he'd been given must have been on the dark side of the moon. But again, no questions asked, no answers given. Perhaps slightly underwhelmed by the task that Ingo had been given, something then caught his attention. Patterns on the surface. No wind on the moon, so how could these patterns have emerged? Swann was pondering, could they even be man-made? After a short coffee break, Swann returned to his remote viewing session, but he noticed a change of atmosphere in the room. Mr. Axelrod now seemed nervous. As Ingo moved across the moon to a crater, that is where he saw something bizarre. Two lights. Two rows of lights. And it was at this point that Ingo Swann turned to Mr. Axelrod and said, "I'm sorry, I've made a mistake. I can't be on the moon because I'm seeing artificial lighting. I must be on Earth somewhere. I apologize." Mr. Axelrod said nothing, standing there in fierce silence. As Ingo continued to explore the coordinates given to him, he found towers then machinery, and then strange-looking buildings, as he called them. He found bridges whose function he could not determine. Domes appeared of various sizes. They even had windows. Obelisks which had no apparent function. As a feeling of disbelief started to settle, Ingo took a shot. He went in for a closer look. He approaches one of these strange dome-looking buildings, and as he peers through one of the windows, he sees people.
Viewed some things on the moon that I thought were really outrageously strange, like people there and big structures and lots of activity and things like that.
These beings looked exactly like us, all male, very hard at work, and I quote, butt-ass naked, definitely a cocaine factory on the moon. Completely awestruck by what he was seeing, suddenly, amongst the busy workforce, two of the beings stopped, turned, and pointed in the direction of the window that Swann was looking into. A frightened Ingo Swann had realized that he had been seen. And it was at this point that Mr. Axelrod stood over Swann and in a calm, low voice said, "Please quickly come away from that place." My eyes were wide as understanding drained in. "You already know they are psychic, don't you?" Axel raised his eyebrows and gave a deep sigh. And at that point, he abruptly closed his folders. "I think we had better end our work here."
But they weren't looking at me back on Earth. They were looking like at the place where I thought I was looking at them on the moon. And I said, well, you know, this is a very highly developed kind of telepathy, if indeed it is telepathy, or it should be even called that. It's just something that I can't really explain. Amongst many other things I can't explain, but it indeed happened that way.
Ingo Swann sadly passed away in 2013. There's no evidence at all to support the claims he makes about the moon in his books. And as I read his book, I did find it fun, but it does strike me as fiction. But Ingo Swann is not here to defend himself against skeptics. And he certainly was studied by highly credentialed scientists who took what he was doing very, very seriously. We know we use a tiny percentage of our brain. I just go outside in public and you can see that. But could it be possible that we can develop some type of wider sense, some type of remote viewing skill or telepathy? Well, I ain't the one to answer. I can hardly see 5 yards in front of me. And so as much as I'm highly skeptical of Ingo Swann's claims, he was a humble, intelligent and very capable man. And to this day, we know very little about the moon. The amount of potentially beneficial information that we could gain from going back to the moon and researching it is immeasurable. So why haven't we?
Neil and Buzz were on the lunar surface. Neil switched to the medical channel and spoke directly with the chief medical officer, saying, "They're here, they're parked on the side of the crater, they're watching us."
I don't have any answers for that, any real answers.